Hey everybody, what's going on? Eric here with Switch Adapted Toys, and today I'm going to be showing you how to adapt the Zumo disc launcher. If you like this video or if you found it helpful, make sure you hit the like button and hit subscribe because we're posting new videos all the time, and that will keep you up to date on all the new toys that we adapt. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. The first thing we need to do is remove all 5 screws on the side of the toy. So with those 5 screws removed, we should be able to separate the 2 halves of the toy. And I'm just going to set this aside, and I'm going to set aside all of the batteries. There's also this little disc here that is a part of the battery compartment. I'm just going to set that aside so I don't lose it. And I'm going to go ahead and remove the trigger. And that will expose the button that the trigger presses. Alright, so this is the button that we're going to adapt. Now we could do one of 2 things. We could just snip the wires that go to this button and solder our headphone jack wires to these 2 wires. And that would work totally fine. The only problem is that you would lose the functionality of actually pulling the trigger. If someone wanted to play with a toy that, without the button, it would make it kind of difficult. So there's a real easy way that we can kind of maintain the functionality of this button, and that's what I'm going to do. So you'll see how we do that here in a second. The first thing that we need to do is drill a hole in the toy so that we can get our headphone jack wire into the toy. So there are a bunch of different places that I feel like we could drill a hole for our headphone jack wire. Where I'm going to drill it is kind of in the back of the toy, kind of in this little section right here, because there's plenty of room around this motor and trigger to fish that wire through. As long as your wire is going to be long enough to reach, that's probably a fine place. You could also probably drill a hole through the front of the toy, but there's just less room up here, so it might get a little crowded, a little bunched up. So I think back here, again, as long as your wire is long enough, that'll be a good place to drill. So using a drill bit that's the same diameter of your headphone jack, we're just going to drill a hole directly through the side of the toy. I'm just going to make sure I don't hit that motor or any wires inside. Just like that. So now we need to go ahead and prep our headphone jack wire, so I'm just going to set that aside. And what we need to do first is remove some of the exterior casing of the wire. So this is the male end of our headphone jack wire that I snipped off. It is a TRS connector. It stands for tip, ring, sleeve, TRS. But many buttons that are common out there are a TS connector, which stands for tip and sleeve. So they don't have a ring. So what we needed to do on our headphone jack wire is combine the ring and sleeve wires together to essentially just form one sleeve wire that will match up with our button. Now that will just ensure that regardless of which button you put into your toy, it should work just fine. So how do we figure out which wires we need to combine? Well, we're going to need a couple things. We're going to need a multimeter and you're going to need a switch button. I'm going to go ahead and plug in my button to my headphone jack wire. And I'm going to go ahead and strip away a little bit of the casing of each of these wires. So for our headphone jack wire, we've got a red wire, a yellow wire, and a white wire. Now the wires that are inside your headphone jack might be completely different colors, but there should be 3. In fact, one of your wires might not even have one of these casings at all. It'll just be the bare wires inside there. But regardless of what colors you have, this method should be able to sort out which wires we need to combine. So I've got my multimeter set to ohms. And what I'm going to do is just touch my probes together, and whenever I do that, you see that I get a reading on the multimeter, and whenever they are disconnected, it shows OL. That's basically telling me I've got a closed circuit and an open circuit. So we're going to use that to figure out which wires we need to combine on our headphone jack wires. So I'm going to start by combining 2 wires together. I'm going to combine the yellow wire and the white wire just by twisting them together lightly. So I'm just going to touch my probes to these wires and you'll see I get a reading right away. So that's telling me that I've got a closed circuit right now, but the button is not being pressed, so it should be an open circuit. And whenever the button is pressed, then I should get a reading. So I know that this is the wrong combination of wires, and I'm going to try a different combination. So now I have the red and yellow wires twisted together, and I'm just going to touch my probes to the wire, and that says OL, which is good. And now I'm going to go ahead and press my button, and I should get a reading on the multimeter. There we go. So that's exactly what we are looking for. Whenever the button is pressed, we get a closed circuit, a reading on the multimeter, and whenever the button is released, it goes back to OL. So that is the combination of wires that I need. Now, again, your wire colors might be different. We find a lot of the times that the white wire will be the tip wire, so that's probably where I would start. But it's a good idea to test it just to make sure that you're not going to have any problems when you go to plug in a button once everything's finally adapted. So this is great. I'm all done here. I can go ahead and put this into my toy. But if one of my wires was bare, so say this white wire just didn't have any wire cover on it at all, I'd want to put a heat shrink wire cover or some electrical tape over this wire to protect it from accidentally touching something else inside the toy and shorting something out. You really just want the tips of the wires exposed, because that's what we're going to use to solder to the toy. So this wire is good to go, so let's go ahead and get it inside the toy. So I'm just going to go ahead and fish my wire through the toy, and making sure that I've got enough slack to reach our button. And I'm going to go ahead and twist my wires together and make sure that they are nice and neat. What you don't want is a bunch of just stray wires kind of hanging out everywhere. So just give them a good twist, make sure that they're nice and neat and nice and tight before we go to solder them to this button. So I could do this a couple different ways. I could just try to solder these wires directly to these probes on this button. What I find that happens a lot of times is that once this probe gets heated up, the wires that are already soldered to it become heated up again and become loose, and oftentimes will become disconnected, which requires me to have to resolder those wires back to the switch. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm just going to go ahead and heat these up so that I can get these wires off of this switch. Alright, now I'm going to strip these wires back, and I'm just going to go ahead and twist them together with my other wires and solder them all together before I go and solder them to the button. So I just stripped back some of that casing on the wire that was attached to the button, and now I'm just going to twist them together. And I'm just going to put some solder on them just to kind of lock them in place, just like that. And I'm going to do the same thing for this other wire. So for the wires that were attached to our button, it doesn't matter which wires we solder them to on our headphone jack. So don't worry about that. So I snipped off that wire cover, and I'm just going to twist this one together and put a little solder on there. Now your soldering job does not need to look pretty, as long as it's, you got a good connection, it'll be totally fine. Alright, so now we can go ahead and solder these back to the button that we disconnected. Now before we put the two halves back together, what I like to do is put a zip tie on the inside of the toy, wrapped around the wire. That will basically act like a barrier, so if someone were to pull on the cord, it doesn't just yank the entire thing out. I find that the smaller the zip tie, the better. It just kind of grips the wire a little bit better. And cinch it down tight. And I'm just going to go ahead and snip off the extra zip tie. And what I like to do just to make sure that that zip tie is not going to slip, I like to use a little bit of CA glue, and I just kind of dab it around the zip tie wire just to kind of lock it in place. And then you can use a little bit of activator, and that basically instantly dries that CA glue. Alright, so you might be wondering to yourself, Eric, what happened? Why is the toy torn apart again? Well, there is a component to this toy that I didn't know was there. So when you pull the trigger, it actually pulls on this little spring. Alright, so just to make matters worse, when I was trying to show you how this spring works, it shot out on me and I cannot find it. It is lost in my carpet somewhere. Someday the vacuum cleaner will figure it out. So when the spring is inside, what happens is when the trigger is pulled, it pulls back this little brake mechanism. And then when the trigger is released, it basically stops the motor from spinning. But because we were bypassing the trigger, the brake was basically just on the whole time. So my initial hopes of being able to maintain the trigger are probably dashed, especially for this one because I have now lost that little spring. So if you still had your spring, what I would probably recommend doing is just removing this brake section. The toy might struggle to kind of get the disc in the air a little bit, but I think that's really the only way we're going to be able to adapt this toy. So this little brake is just glued on there. I would just pull it off and then put it all back together. Wish I had known that before I put everything back together and tried to show you that little spring, but it's fine. These things happen. You know, these toys aren't really meant to be adapted, so a lot of times when I'm trying to show you these videos, we break a lot of toys just trying to figure things out. But I think we can still have fun with this toy, adapted. It's just gonna be a little bit different. So anyways, that happens. Let's get to it. So let's go ahead and put it back together. Unfortunately, I didn't film me taking all this apart because I didn't anticipate me losing these pieces, but anyways, I'll show you how to put it back together. So this blue section goes on the orange section on the net, and then the motor gets put back into its housing and screwed back into place. I definitely wouldn't over tighten these screws because the plastic is very cheap and I'm afraid you'll just strip out the hole. Now we can slip the motor back into place, and there's a little groove between the blue and the orange section that the outside of the toy just kind of slips into like that. And then I'm going to replace the trigger. So I'm going to fish my wires up over the trigger and then put the button back into its housing, just like that. Now I taped these down just to keep them in place as I was fiddling with things. So I'm just going to go ahead and take these batteries out because it is kind of hard to get everything put back together with them in place. And I'm going to put the other side of the toy back on, making sure I don't pinch any of my wires. And then again, I'm going to replace all these screws. And then I'm going to replace the batteries. So now I've got my button plugged in, and let's give it a test, make sure it works. There we go. I'm also going to test the trigger. Funny enough that the button mechanism, you know, it's got a little spring in it itself, and just the mechanism of the button is actually enough resistance for me to press the trigger and then release it and it not just constantly go off. So even without that brake mechanism, that spring, it's still working. But let's put a disc in it and make sure it will still shoot the disc. Alright, so here's the problem with this toy. I think it can still be a fun toy, but there's a reason for that brake mechanism. Basically, when the fan blades get up to speed, it needs to come off the motor, otherwise it just stays kind of in place. So when, like, if I press this button, it'll spin, and if I release it, sometimes it'll just stay in place like that. But other times I can get it to shoot out, just like that. So, does the toy work? Yes. Does it have some quirks? Sure. See, when I release it, it kind of wants to come off, and sometimes it comes off right away. So, I don't know what to tell you. I think it's a fun toy. I think some kids will like it. Does it work just as it did before? No. But it's really the best that we can do with this adaptation. So that's pretty much it. I hope you found this video helpful. I apologize that it's not easier to do. If I were designing toys, I would make them all already adapted and already accessible for everybody. Unfortunately, we kind of struggle sometimes on adapting toys. I think this can be a cool toy. I think it's something that you could do. You actually get 2 of them in a package, so if you end up screwing one up, you could always adapt the other one. I think some kids will really enjoy this toy. Unfortunately, it does have some of those drawbacks. So as long as you're aware of that, I think it's something that you can go ahead and try to adapt. But if you like this video, if you found it helpful, hit the like button and hit subscribe, because it really does help us out in a huge way. So thanks in advance for that. If you want to find out more about Switch Adapted Toys, you could do so on our website at www.switchtoys.org. There we have all of our resources, kind of all in one place, and it's all completely free. We've got all of our videos there, we've got written manuals, we even have files so that you can 3D print your own Switch button. And the button works surprisingly well. I'm very proud of it, and it costs you about $5 in parts and materials to make. So check that out. And on our website, you can find out about Switch chapters. So if you've got a group or an organization and you kind of want to adapt toys for kids in your community, kind of on a bigger scale, you could form what we call a Switch chapter. We've got a bunch of information on our website where you can check that out, and I'll put a link in the description below. Lastly, if you are interested in a Switch adapted toy but doing it yourself is just a little too overwhelming, we do have an Etsy shop where we sell some pre-adapted toys that are ready to play with. The proceeds there help support what we're doing here, and all the toys that we do have in our Etsy shop, we have how-to videos and manuals for. So if you want to do it yourself, we want you to do it yourself, but if you just want the ease of having a toy ready to go, ready to play with, we've got you covered, and you can check out our Etsy shop, and I'll put a link in the description below. Well, I guess that's it. Thanks for checking out this video. My name is Eric with Switch Adapted Toys, and we'll see you next time.
Switched Adapted Toys, making play possible.